My name is Greta. I work as an economist at Swedbank, Lithuania. And I have been analyzing climate change and its impact on our economies for around 4 years. And what still shocks me the most, probably to this day, is that climate change is still sometimes perceived as an opinion. I believe in climate change, I don't believe in climate change. Yet I hope that after this summer, which was heavy of examples of what a warming climate might look like in the future, when Europe lost forests doubled the size of Luxembourg, even skeptics are shifting to the opinion that we must adapt, as well as to better understand how climate change affects us, our societies, and our economies. European Research Institute claims that this Europe's drought was worse than 500 years, with all its consequences: sinking rivers, damaged crops, devastating wildfires. And this summer also showed that climate change might bring some unlikely problems. At the beginning of this energy crisis, France was standing as leader. With all its nuclear power plants, Russia's energy resources were not that important. Yet, with prolonged heat waves with temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, what happened that rivers in France become too hot to cool the plants. So as a result, the French energy supplier was forced to reduce the output even more. They also had some maintenance work, so you can see in this graph that this year, electricity production of nuclear power has dropped to record lows. So that's one of the reasons why electricity prices have skyrocketed in the country. Quite similar problem, yet a bit different, happened in Germany as well. Due to droughts and heat waves, Rhine River, one of the longest in Germany, sunk to record lows. So you can see this orange line. And what happened because of that? So Rhine River is one of the big importance regarding vessels and shipping industrial goods, such as diesel, coal, and other commodities. So massive sandbars breach its midsection, so vessels are just not able to ship goods to the industrial towns of Germany. So it has also affected supply chains in the country, and actually these droughts of Rhine River is getting worse and worse every year. Best examples can be found in the Americas as well. For example, Lake Mead drought is so bad that you can actually see it from space. The American West is currently facing its most severe drought in human history, and research suggests that conditions are drier now than they have been for at least 1,200 years. And Lake Mead is very important, an integral component that divides and allocates Colorado River, which gives water for around 40 million of people in the United States and Mexico, as well as supports dozens of indigenous tribes, 11 national parks, and irrigates around 6 million of acres of farmland. So you can see that photos from space reveal these cracked canyons as well as shrinking lake shorelines. And you can see that from the beginning of this century, this lake, the big reservoir of water, has changed considerably. An equally dramatic drought has also happened in China, as have been mentioned in the previous presentation. So the drought caused rivers that feed the hydroelectric plants to dry up. Authorities, since the drought was so bad that authorities were forced to order manufacturing companies to pause production for about 2 weeks. And we have such international companies such as Toyota, Tesla, that were forced to actually halt production because there was no power. And it was caused by these severe heat waves and droughts. Nowhere else, however, has suffered the extremes of Pakistan, the country which has gone from extreme temperatures of 50 degrees of Celsius to devastating floods in only a few months, when the country also faces economic and political crisis. Around 1/3 of country's territory is submerged by flooding, and it took enormous human and financial losses. Some early estimates point to around 10 billion of US dollars of losses, and it is a very devastating illustration of what a warming climate might look like in the future, as well as the need to adapt our economies to prepare for these possible extreme weather events. As I've mentioned, these extreme weather events and the number of these extreme weather events is growing. Heat waves and floods around the world may be a taste of years to come. And globally, when we look, for example, from 1980s, extreme weather events such as extreme temperature, floods, wildfires, or droughts has increased notably and is increasing further. And scientists say that the likelihood, for example, of heavy rainfall increased from around 2 to 9 times. And the reason is quite simple. Since the climate is getting warmer, we have more moisture in the air. So the likelihood of rains and heavy rains and floods increases. There is a number of studies that employ various simulations regarding the change in global surface temperature. And the simulations show that the cause of climate change is our emissions. As you can see in this yellow line, how the global temperature would change if human factors are not included. It means that solar or, for example, volcanic eruptions did not have a significant impact. And what happens when you include human factors? So then the observed temperature goes hand in hand with simulated temperature, which actually shows one more time that our emissions and our activities are what causes the climate change and temperature to rise. There are also some theories that, for example, changes or fluctuations in CO2 emissions correspond natural Earth cycles. I mean that these are quite natural, and we should not worry a lot about it. And this is probably the longest timeline I've ever seen. This is like 800,000 years of timeline. And you can see natural fluctuations of CO2 emissions. There were some, like, I don't know, it's like in 100,000 years. And ice cores provide unique contributions to the reconstruction of past climate CO2 emissions based on tiny, tiny air bubbles trapped in mile-thick ice cores during the ice age cycles of the past almost 1 million years. So you can see that atmospheric CO2 emissions never exceeded 300 parts per million. So we are standing here right now. So it is CO2 emissions increased by around 50% since 1950s. Despite various pledges, various climate agreements, CO2 emissions are rising. We saw a little drop during the pandemic because of the obvious reason. Part of our economies were forced to shut down. And last year we are back on track. And data indicates that this year we will reach a new record regarding CO2 emissions. And together with growing CO2 emissions, together with increasing temperatures, direct global costs of extreme weather events are rising. It is also a dramatic chart where you can see how much does it cost for us? And in 2007, it has even exceeded $300 billion. And while when you see this trend line, it also indicates that costs are bigger and bigger, and the share of world GDP, even though it still looked quite small, but it is rising. It means that the trend line is going upwards, and the costs will be higher in the future. So direct tangible costs, what I mean by direct extreme weather events, damage to, for example, infrastructure, agriculture, but many more sectors are affected. For example, as I've mentioned in Germany, that supply chains were affected. So for the manufacturing sector, biggest risks come most likely through indirect channels and spillover effects. So weather-related disasters in other parts of the world, it even can be not in Europe, it can be in China, and it can affect supply chains. So delivery times and cause value losses in multiple sectors. Of course, quite directly is affected agricultural sector, and it is of course normal because crops, these react quite directly to extreme weather events, floods, droughts, and etc. And we identified only one slight positive change possible, that changes in climate can also have, for example, increased growing season in northern countries. And what our colleagues said in Sweden, there are more and more winemakers, so maybe we also will have some positive effects. But of course, these positive effects are very small compared to the negative ones. We also have impact for insurance and finance sector. For example, it might be more and more difficult for agriculture companies to get insurance, and it might be not even more difficult, but it even might cost even more because of the increased risks and the claims damages. Yet, when we look to the Baltic countries, we see that Baltic countries are not affected equally. And one of the reasons is like the different economic structure. For example, in Latvia, agricultural sector is of the biggest importance compared to Lithuania, Estonia, and other Nordic countries. But Lithuania also, agricultural sector in Lithuania is also quite important and comprise around more than 3% of country's GDP. So a rise in extreme weather events will likely cause food prices to go up as the supply of crops and livestock decreases or becomes more volatile. Yet I have recently had an opportunity to work with ECB's climate stress tests, and ECB is taking it very seriously, I can tell you. They are making various calculations to help us to understand how many sectors it can affect. And their calculations state that around a third of all companies in different sectors in the euro area are subject to climate risk. So it doesn't matter like if the company is not directly related, for example, to agriculture, but it might be affected through supply chain disruptions, through other various sectors, even regarding the electricity prices we saw in France. We tried to calculate how we, in the Nordics and Baltics, have already paid for extreme weather events. And we found that Lithuania has not paid very much in comparison to Denmark, for example, or EU area average, around 500 million euros. But when you take it and you divide it per capita, then it gives us a little bit less than 300 euros. So it means that every one of you, every one of us have already paid around 300 euros for these extreme weather events. Is it a lot? Is it not a lot? Well, it's probably good to think about it. When we talk about extreme weather events, we often think about, for example, direct tangible costs, cost to infrastructure, cost to buildings. As we have seen in Pakistan, for example, they were like massively affected building infrastructure, but there are also many more costs. For example, that occur as a result of a direct impact. And as I've mentioned, France, Germany, we have business interruption, even supply chain disruption. We also see a lot in productivity losses. For example, when we have a severe heat wave, we have construction sector and workers that are not able to actually work during the extreme temperatures. So their productivity decreases. And we can apply it to the agricultural sector. And we also have some intangible costs. We might not think about it, as Neri said that 3 years ago we were sitting and in extreme heat with 30 degrees of Celsius. So maybe together with these extreme weather events, our quality of life also decreases. Maybe there are some health, well-being impacts. Some studies show that, for example, heat waves are very dangerous for human well-being, because when we have floods, when we have tornadoes, we might go to home and just sit there. But when we have heat waves, we still want to go and walk outside. So we do not take it very seriously. But data shows that it also has a severe impact to our health. And also what we often forget is risk mitigation costs. I mean, the majority of us are thinking about air conditioners. We are thinking about better infrastructure. We are thinking about maybe even stronger buildings in some parts of the world. So we are investing just to mitigate the risks. Maybe we are buying more water during the heat wave, so it's also like helps to mitigate the risks of that heat wave affecting us negatively. So there are many costs and risks that we often forget about, and we should include them in our calculations, and we did that. We actually included these indirect costs in our calculations, and economic studies suggest that all these indirect costs I've mentioned to you could be an addition multiplier of direct costs ranging from almost 2 to over 10 times. So it shows you that we should calculate much more costs in regards to extreme weather events. So we, taking this into account and calculating the indirect costs of using 2 times multiplier, we have chosen this lower band. So yearly losses stand at around 100 million in Lithuania and around 50 million euros in Latvia. So, and when you can see, when we try to look to the future, we can see that these costs will almost double to 2040. And we took the 2 times multiplier. I mean, you could take 10 times multiplier. So it depends how the climate and our climate agreements will work in the future. This summer's extreme weather events set a dramatic tone for the upcoming COP27 meeting, which will be held this year in Egypt, with long-awaited discussions on who bears the blame for these events, and most importantly, who will cover the resulting bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta. Very important topic, and I can see from very difficult questions that it raises controversial reactions, from skepticism to unwillingness to pay. There are contradicting opinions on the correct policy mix. And some even question the fact that perhaps too hard push for the faster green transformation, something that we have already discussed a bit, may have created the situation of insufficient investments in fossil fuels, and now we have a risk of a blackout and shortages of electricity and so on and so on. I personally do not know if it's possible to address this critique. It's incredibly difficult topic, but perhaps you can.
Well, what transition means? What we have now is, like, transition means that from fossil fuels we're going to different channels of, for example, renewable energies. We can also think, for example, is a transition really happening? I mean, on the national level, maybe yes, we have, for example, more electric cars. But at the global level, we are exporting these cars to poorer countries. So that's why CO2 emissions are growing. And in regards to investments, that is also that we are pushing out coal, we are pushing out oil, but we forgot that we should invest more in renewables, in these sources that are not CO2 emitting. And that's probably what this transition means. I'm not sure that we really do this real transition yet.
Thank you, Greta. We have more questions, but not enough time, so we will address them a bit later.